Okay, there we go. So once again, it's a real pleasure, and yes, I do hope we get a chance at some point in the not too distant future to have that cafe in Montreal, which is a city I love very much. So, but for now, you'll just have to deal with this somewhat two-dimensional picture of mine, and I hope that's going to be all right. I'm really looking forward to this and to your feedback, because I just decided to take this opportunity to present work in progress. And as you can see here from the slide, this is as often with me, a course at work. So you see the people there. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk about the social basis, the social composition of political parties, and why that's important for understanding political conflict in advanced democracies. And so up to this time, let me just actually interrupt myself here and simply say I'm going to open my chat box if I can find it. Should there be a question, it's probably best to just alert me to that in the chat box. I'll try to keep my eye on that. So up to this time, most efforts to assess political competition and the structure of conflict have focused on voters and on electoral choice. And today I'd like to turn the tables and look at political conflict and the structure of political conflict from the perspective of parties. I'm going to ask three questions. To what extent do political parties have distinct constituencies? What aspects of social structure are expressed in which parties? And what does this social composition of parties tell us about social conflict over time, or political conflict over time? So a party-centric perspective obviously is not going to replace a voter-centric perspective, but I believe it can reveal patterns that may otherwise remain hidden. And most importantly, it can alert you, to borrow Schatzsnyder's wonderful words, to which social conflicts are organized into politics and which ones are organized out of politics. So I'm going to say quite a bit about measurement. Ruth kindly introduced me as one of my contributions as a data person or a measurement person. Well, here I am, just true to form, I suppose, because I think a comparative yardstick helps us get to that Schatzsnyder question. And while my evidence is on Europe, my argument aims to be more general. Let me see whether this moves here the way I want to. There we go. But before I get to the measurement, let me say a bit about the theoretical underpinnings of the measure, which is cleavage theory. And here I'm going to highlight three things from cleavage theory. One, change to the party system comes from outside, an exogenous shock that deeply impacts the lives and livelihoods of a particular social group or groups. And the word particular is important here, because it indicates there is a structural basis, and that basis is indeed specific. There is a social characteristic that loads the dice for some, that shapes who wins and who loses at a particular point, and indicates where the battle lines will be drawn. And then the third aspect there that you say, it's mostly new parties that you would expect to respond to this conflict, not old parties, because old parties are much more tied down by their reputations, by their constituency base, by their militants. And so you'd expect these new parties, not necessarily old parties, to be structured on that new social characteristic, that particular social characteristic. How this applies to contemporary party systems in advanced democracies, Gary Marks and I have published on this elsewhere, and in forthcoming work with the co-authors you saw on the screen there, we go further on this. We focus on the exogenous shock to be about transnationalization. And that's rooted in an informational revolution that generated a tremendous thirst for workers with formal education that greatly expanded the social, professional, occupational class, and then shifted the organization of production from national to transnational markets in a big way. It's always difficult to pinpoint a starting point, as similar as it was difficult to pinpoint a starting point for, say, the Liesbet and Hooghe cleavages of industrialization or nationalization but let's say 70s, 1980s, 1990s, particularly then for the shift towards transnational markets. And that has been facilitated by decisions, government decisions, political decisions to reduce barriers to trade, lower the costs of immigration, and develop international rules that can enforce transnational contracts. And so the rise in international authority has been instrumental in precisely that. And in Europe, of course, or in the European Union, this has been taking a very specific form in terms of the triad of the single market, common citizenship, a common currency, right? So what these do, trade, migration, international governance, or the specific European equivalents of that, they have something in common. They punch holes in what a national community is. They put the spotlight on a particular social characteristic with tremendous power to change people's lives. That characteristic is education, in a situation of an information revolution and knowledge economy, as Iverson and Soskis call it in their most recent talk. And they feed tensions between those that have and have not, those that are well positioned and those that are not so well positioned to compete in this new transnational economy and society. And then the new parties that reflect and amplify these tensions are what we've called GAL and TAN parties. GAL, Green Alternative Libertarian; TAN, Traditional Authority or Authoritarian National. So GAL parties are green parties or social liberal parties. The TAN parties, populist nationalist parties. So the questions then become, do these new parties have a distinctive social basis, and more so than the older parties? And what is happening with the parties on the old cleavages, particularly the class cleavage and the social and the religious cleavage? So we need a measure of party social composition that can travel, that can be applied to any social characteristic, any kind of party, whether it's large or small, whether it's old or new, and over time. And let me just illustrate first, working my way to the measure, how a voter and a party perspective might differ, and show you different things, two different sides of the same reality. Take, and this is what you see here on the slide, take the British Labour Party before World War I, which, as we know, was then mostly composed of industrial workers. But at the same time, the bulk of industrial workers didn't vote for the British Labour Party. From a voter perspective, look at the row in this 2x2. What you then see is something like the following, that of all 45 workers, 45%, you can see these as cell percentages, only 15 vote for Labour, say pre-World War I, so that's 1 in 3. That's what you would see from a voter perspective. From a party perspective, you see something different, quite different, same reality, but different slice of that reality. Follow the column in this game. Of Labour's 20 voters, 15 are workers. So that is 75% of Labour's electorate consists of industrial workers, so 3 and 4. So both are revealing in different ways. They tell different stories of a similar reality, the same reality. Now, as I mentioned at the start, I think there's a lot of work out there from the voters' perspective, so I'm just going to be turning that around, and I'm going to present or talk now more, what do we see and what does it mean, what does it imply from a party perspective? Because indeed this voter party paradox, you could say it's a paradox because these results look very different and yet it is the same reality, has deep theoretical implications. Studies that focus on the voter mostly probed the decline of occupational structure and the rise of values and issues in explaining vote choice. And that gave credence to, you can call it de-alignment theory, or you can call it destructuration theory, the notion that individual voters became more and more detached from their social moorings. But a party perspective would lead you to think, well, wait a minute, this may depend on which part of the system, the party system you're looking at. So from a party perspective, you may see structure very much persisting, perhaps even growing among certain parties, while you see it waning among others. And so cleavage theory would expect that while some cleavages recede, that's destructuration, others may take shape, that's destructuration. So this is now a measure of party structuration or party composition, social composition, call it P, and let P be the social basis of a party. I say this our socialist party with respect to a social characteristic. J, say industrial worker in this particular case. And then P would simply be, take the proportion of socialist voters who are industrial workers. That is your pi J over I, minus the proportion of industrial workers in the society, which is your pi, the marginal of J. And you can multiply that by 100 to turn this in percentage. But let's just apply this to our example above. The proportion of socialist voters who are industrial workers is 75%. You see that at the bottom there. Minus the proportion of industrial workers in the society, which is 45%. So you get a p-value of plus 30. Theoretically, the p-value can vary between plus 100 to minus 100. So plus 30 is clearly overrepresentation of industrial workers in a party relative to the representation in the society. So that's a positive. That's essentially where British Labour stood before World War I, around plus 30. Imagine that the other column there, other parties were a simple party, one, which it's not, but let's assume for a moment, for simplicity's sake, this is the Conservative Party. Then that would have a negative p-value because you would have 30%, that is the cell percentage that you see there, minus the same 45%, which is the marginal of the first row, which is a value, a p-value of minus 5. Essentially suggesting that the Conservative Party is slightly underrepresenting the workers, industrial workers. So that's the simple measure, and I think it has two values. One is its simplicity, because all you're doing is you're using raw numbers derived from a crosstab, and it can be estimated irrespective of how many parties there are in a party system, or irrespective of their relative position vis-a-vis some ideological dimension. So one does not need to make assumptions about the structure of the party system or the voter decision-making. And that is, in technical terms, it's a measure that is non-parametrically identified. Now, from a voter perspective, this is as good as impossible because vote choice is always conditional, right? The more parties compete, the more difficult it is to point predict support for a political party because voters have a range of choices from which they need to pick just one. And the more you have 2 or 3 parties that are close ideological neighbors, imagine in the Netherlands, P van de A, or and SP and GroenLinks, so the Social Democrats, the Socialist Party and GroenLinks, the IIA assumption of independence of irrelevant alternatives may not hold. And that has been the bane of multinomial logit and conditional logit models. So here, you don't have to worry about this because the measure is essentially traveling irrespective of these contextual elements. So that's one. And the second is that when you're looking at the formula here, you see 2 components. And the 2 components actually pick up the 2 forms of change that people have theorized with respect to party composition. I'm thinking of starting with the work by Mayer and Bartolini, but a recent work by Robin Best, by Lachar, by Goldberg, and so forth, two key sources of change in party position is behavioral change and structural change. So behavioral change, a social group may become more or less loyal to the party, and this can affect the party's composition. That's the first component, group share in the party. And the structural change, a social group may become more or less sizable in the society, may grow or shrink as a proportion of the society. And that's been called the structural effect. So that's the second component in the formula that you have in the equation. So the first part is behavior, the second part is structure. And if you just simply extract these from each other, this is the p-value, the party compositional structure, the result of both. Let me just show this visually with an example. These are real parties. The figure plots 15 socialist parties in 8 EU countries in 1975. Why 8? Well, these were the EU members, the members of the European Union in 1975, and these were the countries for which we had questions asked in one of the earliest Eurobarometers that we have available. And I have the questions that we need to tap party composition. So we need compositional questions, and we need, of course, party vote as well. And you see the two axes there. The y-axis plots behavior. It's simply the percentage of voters in a party who are workers. That's all it is. And the x-axis plots structure, which is the percentage of workers in the society in which that party is located. So you can see there's variation on both axes, but most of all on the behavioral axis. And if you are interested in numbers on the behavioral axis, it varies between 14%, so that's the y-axis, right? 14% all the way up to 73%. I believe 14% is a party in Italy, and all the way up to 73% is the British Labour Party there that you see. So that's a 59% range, while on structure, the range is quite a bit smaller. It goes from 27 to 53%, which is a 20% range. The size of the circles, you probably already guessed, is just reflecting the vote share at the point of the survey, so in 1975. Now look at the diagonal. The diagonal is where behavior and structure are exactly the same. That is where the proportion of a certain social group, in this case industrial workers, in the party is exactly the same, reflects the proportion of industrial workers in the society. And so the closer to the diagonal, the more the party's composition is simply a mirror of that of the society. And so the less the party is socially structured, or at least distinctively structured, compared to the society. And you can estimate P from here. And this is what I've drawn there, those two vertical lines. Sorry, I apologize for that. I have someone, actually a gardener. This is what happens, which wouldn't have happened if I'd been in, right there physically with you present. Okay, so you can estimate P from here. And it's the vertical distance from the diagonal, positive values above the diagonal and negative values below. So you can see that P is positive for all but 2 left parties in 1975, and I gave you 2 examples there. For example, for the Parti Socialiste, French party, it's +7, which is 35 on the behavioral axis, -28 on the structural axis. So that's how it works. So let's just now look at how the social basis of party support has shifted since 1975, and whether we detect destructuration, of where we detect it and where we might find restructuration. So you see the solid bubbles again denote the political parties in the same 8 EU countries that, that were on the previous graph. Simply, so if you're really interested in change holding composition of the coverage, or holding coverage constant, let's focus on the solid bubbles here. The hollow bubbles are countries that for which we acquire data in later ways of the Eurobarometer, and then also we add to that European election surveys and European social surveys. That's in the bottom left corner there. So that in the end, the 2018 panels that you see there cover 30 countries, but the 1975 panel only covers 8 countries. So that's the context. Now, I know there's a lot to take in here, so I'll take it slow. And let's look at the top panel first, which are the socialist parties. By socialist parties, by the way, I mean both social democratic parties and radical left parties, communist or post-communist parties in Europe. And what you see there, moving from the left panel to the right panel, is a uniformly sharp structural decline of the industrial working class. We all know of this, and it is indeed that comes out in the data as well. Actually, a decline of about more than 60% in the 8 EU countries. And that's the westward movement that you see of the solid circles. So going from 80% on the x-axis, actually from a maximum of, it was maximum was 36% in 75, down to 14% in 2018. But you also see a significant and uniform behavioral decline across the parties, in the sense that you see these circles drop down, you literally see them dropping down onto the diagonal, so that by 2018, socialist parties are barely distinctive in terms of how they represent industrial workers compared to other parties, compared to the proportion of industrial workers in the society at large. So to give you a sense of what that means in terms of P, which you could calculate by drawing the center, from the center of a circle to the diagonal, right? That is on average a shift from plus 12.9% in 1975 to plus 2.4% in 2018. So Socialist Party are no longer the preferred home for industrial workers. They're simply one among many parties where, for which industrial workers vote. It's a pretty uniform destructuration picture, driven by both structural and behavioral change. So that's for the Socialist Party, for the class cleavage, or the parties that have been theorized to be the core holders of the class cleavage. And the bottom panel does the same for Christian democratic parties, which are of course the key proponents on the religious cleavage. And religiosity here is measured as whether someone goes to service at least once a year, to go to church at least once a week. Once a week. That's the measure, weekly churchgoers. We've played around with other operationalizations of religiosity. It doesn't matter very much, but this is the one that travels best across the different questions used in the 3 data sources that we wanted to combine, so to maximize, triangulate potential biases in the particular data sources, the EB, the ES, and the ESS. And so what this picture shows is nicely that you can have a uniform structural decline, but divergent behavioral reactions. So let's look at a fairly uniform structural decline. In 1975, see these dark solid circles. There's one party that stands out there, you probably can guess, that's the Irish Fine Gael at that point. But as we go to 2018, virtually in every country, you've seen a sharp decline in religiosity, measured as we have here. In fact, the numbers are a drop from on average 36% in 1975 to just 13% of population in those 8 countries that go to church weekly or at least weekly. But that's one thing, uniform structural decline, that's of course secularization. But the behavioral response has been quite different, and you see bifurcation. with some Christian democratic parties becoming more religiously distinctive. And you see that some of these circles actually go up, that distance themselves from the diagonal, right? While most Christian democratic parties have, like the socialist parties, have actually become more convergent, have just narrowed their difference with the diagonal, have become more like your median voter in the societies in which they compete. So you can probably already see from the size of the circles what's going on here. The few Christian democratic parties that have become more distinctive, have this very high p-value, tend to be very small parties. It's party size, while the larger parties have become mirrors of their society on religion. So there is destructuration on religion, but it's partial, and it is quite divergent, particularly compared to the size of the parties. So that's for the two traditional cleavages. Where do we stand, and what can we learn from this for the new cleavage, the transnational cleavage? And here you see a same kind of picture, but this time for the GAL and the TAN parties. Remember, GAL parties being the Green and Social Liberal parties, and TAN parties, the populist nationalist parties. And the social characteristic we theorize as being distinctive is education, and that we measure as whether someone completed post-secondary education or more, yes or no. Again, 3 time points. We started in 1985 because frankly, there isn't much to see in 1975. There is no populist TAN party, and there are very, very few, there's 2, if I remember correctly, Green parties. So, and that is precisely because this is the new cleavage. So you got to actually wait till 85 before you see something. The most striking feature here is how these 2 party families have become increasingly distinctive, have diverged in terms of how they compare to how they stand with respect to the diagonal, which is essentially the axis that shows a p-value that would be 0. And there are each other's mirror images with GAL parties from the start and continuing to be highly overrepresentative for highly educated voters, and TAN parties having become markedly underrepresentative for educated, post-secondary educated voters. So the difference in 2018 between these is more than 30%. So to give you a figure that expresses this, the probability that a TAN voter is highly educated in 2018 for these countries is just 30.6%, compared to 61.6% for a GAL voter. So that's 31% actually. So GAL and parties and TAN parties have reinforced their distinctive social composition. And what's striking is they've done this in the face of a growing segment of the population becoming more highly educated. It hasn't muted the distinctiveness of the GAL parties, for example, in terms of education. And also in the face of their growing electoral strength. So as these parties have become more popular in the voting booth, they have not lost their distinctiveness. This is a different way of looking at this. Is the annual trend of the p-values for GAL parties and TAN parties, again for these 8 countries since 1975, a broad sweep where you see the increasing divergence in the educational base of these parties. Distinctiveness growing rather than declining. Let me conclude with a cross-sectional picture. And this, using a network algorithm and its data, you can aggregate these p-scores into to the party family level. This is what we do here. And we pull data from the 9 available European social survey waves for 30 countries. So this is now really a broad cross-sectional sweep. These are dyadic comparisons of the p-score of 2 party families on a social characteristic. Now, network analysis usually used to estimate the strength of the ties, the similarity between two agents or 2 actors. This indicates the difference between 2 party families, whereby the thickness and the color show indeed the difference. The darker and the thicker, the more different 2 party families are. And let me just highlight a couple of takeaways. Let's focus on the biggest inset, which is on education. Every difference of more than 20% is linked to a tan party, tan family, or to the gal family. Gal being green and social liberal. And because sometimes it's said, you know, for clarity, I just decided to unpack gal and show the results differently for green parties and social liberal parties. And the deepest divide of all is between the green parties and the tan parties. There's no appreciable difference in contrast between the mainstream parties or the old parties, the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, the Conservatives, the economic liberals. They're all fairly similar among each other on education. And even the radical left, which you would expect perhaps to be more distinctive, but it is not. So that's what you see on education. And the last thing I'm going to show here, or just flag, is the one in the top left, because that's the old class cleavage. That's industrial worker we looked at before. And what comes out here is really the limited structuration that is still there on class as measured as industrial worker. And where you do find some meaningful differences, those are the orange lines, a difference between 15 and 20% in the p-score between 2 party families. It's got nothing to do with the classical parties that, according to Liesbet and Hooghe, were the fundamental political expression of the class cleavage, not with the Social Democrats, not with the economic liberals, not with the conservative parties, not with the radical left, but it's got to do with those new parties, the green, the social liberal, and the tan parties, and to some extent also the economic liberals. So restructuration and destructuration go side by side. I skip in the interest of time because I want to give some time for Q&A. I'm going to skip this and just simply conclude. Restructuration and restructuration can go side by side, and I've tried to show how they have. And so there appears to be no end to cleavage generation. Thank you, and looking forward to your questions. I think I'm going to stop sharing now so I can see you better.
Thanks for that really insightful presentation. We've got plenty of time for questions. So what I would suggest is that you could raise your hand virtually. You can see everyone, so if you want to, you can raise your hand. You can actually raise your hand as well, and I try to keep an eye to make sure I see all the videos for those who want to do so. You can write a note in the chat as well, and then Liesbet Hooghe can take some time to respond to all your questions. Anyone wants to start off the discussion? Right. If there's no questions yet, then I can start off with a question, maybe. Find this really fascinating, and I think what I find most thought-provoking is the sort of link to structural change and the behavioral change, but also the size of parties that you saw. And I sort of wonder what we can learn about this in terms of what parties should be doing if they want to make sure that they still win votes and potentially win elections. So if there's a structural change, then I guess strategically a party should move away from focusing too much on a shrinking group of the population, which makes sense, I guess, in terms of what we saw for the behavior of workers, brought to workers, and then for church as well, because the parties still focusing on those seem to be small parties. But then how can we explain that the sort of town parties decided to focus on the group that is a shrinking part of the electorate, and still they're electorally successful? I sort of wonder, I guess, what you make of that, and whether you've got any hunches of what this all means, and whether we can learn anything about what parties should be doing when a group is changing in terms of its size in the population.
Good. This is an interesting question. What should parties be doing, or to put it in a less normative way, as you put it yourself, that is, why do parties seem to be doing something that appears irrational from an electoral point of view? And I think whether something is irrational, one answer, I have two elements to the answer, I think. One is, what is irrational is very much bounded, or rational is very much bounded by the electoral system. I didn't mention that, but there are differences clearly between a plurality system and a PR system. So in a PR system, it obviously makes sense, or parties can survive even as their base shrinks, and if they can become the home for a shrinking base, they can very much still have a role to play in a PR system. And that's precisely what you're seeing with some of these Christian democratic parties, which we now sometimes call confessional parties, right? Like the ChristenUnie, for example, in the Netherlands. They are thriving from their perspective. They are becoming also more homogeneously and perhaps more exclusively the standard bearers of a particular way of life, right? So that's not necessarily irrational to do. In a plurality system, clearly, this may just be the death knell for a party. But the other thing, and this leads to your point of populist parties or radical tan parties or radical right parties, why would they cater for a declining group of voters? Well, the point of a cleavage party would say is because they are expressing anguish. They are expressing an intensity of preferences that has to do, that is rooted in, I just mentioned, what this exogenous shock does, it upends lives and livelihoods, right? And a cleavage perspective would lead you to predict that mediated by the institutional and the electoral institutions, this would find expression in party politics, right? So again, there is a rationality, but bounded by both the nature of conflict that I would argue is pretty deep. This is not just about a set of issues that will disappear in the next electoral cycle. But if you buy our argument that this is the beginning of a cleavage tends to be around for a generation at least, and therefore is likely to leave its imprint for a generation. The decline is relative. The exclusive nature of focusing on industrial workers is also relative. Populist tan parties, that's not their predominant characteristic. They do appeal to industrial workers, but it's one of the occupational categories they appeal to. They do appeal to less educated voters, or more particularly, they do particularly badly among highly educated voters. But post-secondary educated voters are still a minority of the population, and probably will continue to be that in most countries for quite a while, if not for maybe for a longer time, particularly because this is where I just conclude on this point, particularly because as what has become politicized in this new cleavage politics is the virtue of education, and especially of post-secondary general formal education, which might turn off people of pursuing that kind of educational path.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I see Olivier has got a question.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I really find the measure particularly interesting. and I'm interested in using it myself. I want to have your opinion on whether you think that this measure can be used a bit like a left-right index to measure parties' position, and then to use. I am actually wondering if it's possible to construct this measure for a relatively large number of countries and of time periods. Like, is it available? Like, how many data points you have, etc. And secondly, I'm thinking about, so you looked at the over and under representation of educated voters, of workers, and of churchgoers. I was thinking we should, I mean, people in general should do this representation by income groups, like the low income people and the high income people. Are they represented by parties? And whether or not this influences parties' position on different things. I think this would be very interesting. So I wonder if you had this idea of looking at other characteristics of voters than these three main ones, and if this data set is available or easy to replicate in order to have a relatively large number of countries and years.
Thank you for the question. Well, the paper is under review. So we'll just see. And obviously, as soon as we can place it somewhere, the replication data set will clearly be posted. That's for sure. The measure itself is actually relatively simply to construct. You have the formula there. That's all you need, provided that you have two pieces of data. So we drew this from surveys. One is simply the proportion of people on a social characteristic in the society at large, which you can just simply pull from the survey, which we did. Or you might say, well, there's also objective census-based data out there. That is a choice you can make. In our case, it was internal to the survey. The other part is the proportion of people on a certain characteristic that vote, sorry, the proportion of the proportion in a party of people of a certain characteristic. As long as the surveys have questions that tap the particular social characteristic you're interested in, you could calculate this quite easily. So we focused on class, operationalized as industrial worker, religion, operationalized as religion, religiosity, and education, because for us, theoretically, these made most sense. But it's nothing that prevents you, if there is a theoretical reason for it, to employ income, or to employ rural urban or gender. In fact, we've done it with rural urban and gender, but I didn't show the data here, for didn't want to make the story even more complicated. So I think this travels. I think it travels in the sense that it is commensurate across countries, types of parties, and over time, as long as you have questions or measures in surveys that are relatively commensurate, right? That allow you to travel cross-sectionally or temporally. We haven't used it beyond Europe. I mean, I imagine one could think of, provided there are data available, one can think of calculating this for Latin America as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yes, very much. But just to know, like, approximately how many time points do you have in your paper actually currently?
Okay, the paper. So we started in 1975. We actually, for each survey is a time point. That's what it is. For the Eurobarometer, that is annual. Even there's 2 surveys per year, but we combine them because every survey comes with obviously potential biases in terms of sampling and so on. So to minimize that, we combine Eurobarometer, perhaps the least well regarded of the 3 instruments, but it has the longest time span. For the EES, European Election Survey, it's only every 5 years because that's when it's run. and for the European Social Survey is every 2 years. And the European Social Survey has the advantage that it has countries outside the European Union. So for example, we included Norway and Switzerland in there, but one could plausibly also calculate this for Turkey. We are not interested in this because we were focusing on advanced democracies, but in principle one could, and Russia is in the ESS as well. So it depends on the instruments that you have available, and then you can calculate it for as often, you know, for each time that you have a reading on both vote and social characteristics of interest.
Thank you very much.
Good. We still have lots of time for questions, so please don't be shy. And Henry.
Okay, is that okay?
Yeah.
This follows the last question. I think this is a very useful way of explaining what's going on. If I were to think to add another dimension, I would think that, and the question is how to incorporate this. I think a lot of what's happening in this process of change is tied to not so much industrialization, but technologization. That is, some regions are becoming high-tech and other regions are falling behind. It's not just rural urban, it's areas where these big companies like San Francisco or Seattle or Boston, places like that, and even those who are less educated and more working class nevertheless benefit from that, while in other areas where that's not happening, there you have falling behind, and I guess the appeal of these other parties that you described. Mm-hmm. Can you incorporate that in this kind of analysis? Because I think that's a crucial factor in what we're describing.
Henry, I totally agree. I think, so some talk about mega cities versus the rest, or metropolitan governance versus the rest. And I agree that is probably a more valid framing of the rural-urban divide, the regeneration of the rural-urban divide, than you know, the classical rural-urban in a Rockanian sense. The problem with the data sources that we're using here, and I think most cross-sectional or cross-national data sources, I should say, is that we don't have fine-grained estimates of this metropolis element, right? We played with rural urban, and I think we are not quite done with it. But the problem, so theoretically, I totally go along with you. In operational terms, we've had real issues in capturing this. Because the questions, for example, in European Social Survey, are not commensurate. The way rural-urban is captured, country by country, is not the same across. And it doesn't also get to that metropole versus the rest type of thing. So if we could find data that are more, because you have to have it at the individual level, you have to be able to attribute a social characteristic to an individual voter. Right, that's the issue. So my sense is, beyond surveys, we wouldn't know how to do that, right? So that's the challenge in this. But I think there is more work to be done, and it could certainly be done with surveys that one designs for that purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Is there more questions from the audience? Yeah, Andre?
Yes, I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of the presentation. I had another meeting, so my question might not be appropriate. I wonder whether you can look at what happens when a new party emerges and how this affects the results. I suppose that you don't have a party for each type in each case. So would it be possible to see what happens when a new party emerges and how this affects the results?
I'm trying to think. And please tell me if I am not answering your question properly. I'm trying to think this through. So what I was trying to show is keeping countries constant, and not necessarily parties, right? So, for example, were you there when I was talking about the 6 panels with socialist parties and Christian democratic parties? Did you see that part? Okay.
Yeah.
I was showing a panel data whereby you could see derive the p-value, the extent of structuration for socialist parties in 1975, 2002, 2018, keeping the countries constant, not necessarily the parties, because some might die or might emerge and so forth. The p-value for each party is independent of whatever other parties are in the system, and is not going to shift depending on other parties in the system, because all you need is 2 pieces of information. You need the proportion of people with a certain characteristic in the society at large. That, of course, is going to shift over time because societies change. And you need the proportion of people with that same characteristic among a party's voters, right? And so that is not affected, or the calculation of it is not affected by whether there is other parties around or whether some parties are ideologically closer or not to a certain party. It will not affect that particular number. What we haven't done, at least that's what we theoretically and mathematically show or argue in the paper. What we haven't done is your test of what happens if you keep parties constant. That's what you're asking, I guess, and how that might affect the p-score. My first cut at this would be I keep the parties constant between 75 and 2018. I will lose the parties that are not there in both time points. Their p-score is not going to change. The p-score is given by those 2 pieces of information in 1975 and in 2018. But I'm not sure I'm addressing your concern quite properly. So please feel free to rephrase or to follow up.
And the problem is that I haven't, followed everything, so I'm not sure I understand exactly what you've done. So it might be sort of unfair, but it's sort of basically sort of a simple question in a way that, how much of this pattern is due to, to the demand or to the offer, to supply? How much of this change over time is due to the parties versus changes in the electorate?
Well, I think that's what we're trying to get at by separating structure and behavior, right? Because structure captures changes in the electorate, or to put it in our terms, changes in the society. So if a social group shrinks, then that is reflected in a shift along that structural x-axis, while changes in behavior, parties, is reflected in the behavioral dimension, which is the y-axis. But I'll be happy to send you the paper, André.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think Kamin Chan had a question.
Yeah, thanks for your brilliant presentation. I just want to try to reframe Professor Blake's question. That is, in every country, for example, Germany, there's an emergence of Green Party, or AfD, there's the TAN Party. Whether there is change of p-value of, let's say, conservative, there's the CDU, or emergence of Green Party, there's a drop in the p-value for the Social Democrats. And I think that's the question. For each European country, when there's a emergence of GAL or 10-party, the neighborhood or what we usually call mainstream party, where the p-value drop. Yeah, I think that's the question.
Okay, well, not necessarily, right? In fact, if anything, if there is an emergence of a party that is socially distinctive on a particular characteristic, one would think then yin yang, that there would be space for a party that's socially distinctive in the opposite direction on that characteristic. That is, a positive P should give a negative P somewhere else. Not necessarily, because so imagine you take your highly educated voters that flock to a Green Party, right? Then the other parties will either the other parties will be deprived, if you say, of highly educated voters because they flock to the Green Party, and therefore will either fall into negative territory because they will underrepresent it relative to society as a whole, or they will get closer to, they will be closer to the mean because they spread the kind of the deprivation among them. But you'd almost expect, if there is one party that becomes overrepresented, that has a high positive p-value, there would be space for another party that has a high negative value. Is that another way of rephrasing your comments, or does it begin to provide an answer to your question?
I think that's.
But
yeah,
I think the point is that it is, and that's why I wanted to show the last slide, where you see all party families, and you can, of course can do that, you know, at a societal level. You can do that for a country. What we did there, we pooled data from 30 countries inside party families. We could imagine that you could do a network like this for a particular country at a given point in time. And so then clearly map out the over and under representation and also the distinctiveness, because it's based on P's, of individual parties vis-a-vis each other.
I think we've got time for a final question, and Russ Dalton's got a question.
Do you want to read it, Ruth?
Sure, I'll read it on behalf of Russ. Great project, new ideas, and I love your bubble graphs. I'm wondering who started this process. Using the working class example, did the party decrease their class advocation, or did the voters leave the party first? Have you explored this?
I didn't want to read it because I thought the first sentence is too nice, and I didn't want to read that to myself. So thank you, Russ. When you ask, I'm wondering who started this process. You ask, is it the parties or the voters, right? I think cleavage theory would primarily see this as a demand-driven process. That is, it's the voters that move to parties that and create a space for party entrepreneurs. So I'm hedging my bets here a bit, for party entrepreneurs to take up voters discontented within a certain, as a result of some sort of exogenous shock. So I think that's what the theory would predict, that voters move, old parties or existing parties are poorly positioned to pick up issues or concerns that are fundamentally different from the ones that they were designed to represent. So most of the change will come through new parties. Now, in a true Liesbet Hooghean fashion, all this should be mediated through institutions, electoral and others. And I don't need to tell you that because you've written plenty on this. So obviously the logic will work empirically somewhat differently, and plurality systems and in PR systems. That relates back to Ruth's first question. But by and large, that one would expect to be the thrust of it, voters driving change. Now, the second part of the question is, have we actually modeled this? Have we sought to model this, explore it? And we have not. And I'm going to have to think about this, how we might, best do this, or how our P measure might be associated and might just hopefully leverage this this modeling. It's a really good thing, good thoughts, and I will write that down.
It's already almost 4:10, so on that note, we'll end the seminar here. Please join me in thanking Professor Hooghe again for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to thank everyone for taking part in the discussion as well. A few more practical things. Well, one practical things. Importantly, there's a roundtable plan to discuss the upcoming US election on the 30th of October at 3 p.m. So I hope that you can all join for that as well. And then one thing that every seminar of the CSDC speaker series ends with is a gift that we usually give to the speakers to thank them. And it's sort of the brand of the CSDC is that very special gift that we usually have. Now on Zoom, that's a bit difficult, but I think Wim has the gift for you, and we'll definitely ship it to you. I'm not sure if he can show it right now or whether he's got it with him or not, but for sure there's a gift. Everyone, all the members of the center know what the gift is, and they know you'll be so, oh, there it is.
I trust your good taste, though. I know it's going to be something I like.
Wim, I suggest that you open your mic so we will have you larger on the screen. It will be more clear for a guest to see the gift. Say something.
It's a bit redundant to read the, it's a copy of the poster on the cup.
A cleavage theory. Oh, wonderful. Wow. That's very nice indeed. Oh, that will get pride of place.
I will email and ask you for the address to send it to.
Okay. Well, let me thank every one of you for this opportunity. As I said, this is work in progress, and I've already picked up some ideas of what I think should look at, pursue in no doubt revising this paper. Any paper that's submitted comes back, and whatever the result is, it comes back and it will be revised. That is for certain. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us.